Thank you, Laura. And thank you everyone for coming today. I'm surprised we have such a nice turnout. I'm very happy. Before I get started, I want to make a few quick acknowledgments, and don't worry, I'm not going to read all of these names. That would not be quick. But the paper that I'm presenting today is a condensed form of a paper that's coming out in a journal in 2010, and I really want to acknowledge Professor Valerie Jenis at UCI. She was the principal investigator on this study and my co-author on the paper, and also Professor Jennifer Sumner of Penn State Harrisburg. She's the third author on this paper. So to give you an idea of how I'm going to present this today, I'd like to first do a quick introduction to what it means to be a transgender inmate in prison, or in a men's prison specifically, followed by a brief overview of the methodology of the study that the paper is based on, and then some findings and brief conclusions. In the book, Discipline and Punish, Foucault noted that punishment has become something of a more private phenomenon. From the public spectacle of hangings and torture to incarceration, the basic processes of punishment have been taken out of the public eye. So right now we know that there are prisons, we see them, we drive past them, we see TV shows about them, but we don't really know what goes on inside prisons or what inmates' lives are like unless we've been an inmate or really spent significant amounts of time inside prison. And this is particularly true for transgender inmates. As if punishment wasn't hidden enough inside prisons, the fact that there are women locked inside men's prisons now is even more invisible to the general public. And at the time that we collected the data for our study, there were over 300 female inmates in men's prisons in California. We talked to 315, depending on how you count the numbers. There are about 330 to 350 women living in men's prisons in California. And what I'd like to do today is present some stories about them, some numbers, some statistics, and basically explain to you how they compare to other distinct populations. Now, the basic research question that we asked for this paper are, what are the basic demographic characteristics of transgender inmates in California's men's prisons? Because no one really knows much about this population. No empirical research has been done that's really systematic or methodologically rigorous. And furthermore, how do these characteristics of this group compare to other populations, such as the US population, the California population, the prison populations of those two areas, and also the non-incarcerated transgender population? Now, to answer these questions, we collected two types of data. The first was original data collected by 8 interviewers over the course of 9 weeks. We went to 27 prisons out of the 33 in California. 26 of them were prisons for men, that's what I'm going to focus on today. And we conducted 315 face-to-face interviews with transgender women in men's prisons. The interviews were semi-structured, they were about an hour each. But basically the data that we collected was very rich in a lot of different ways. But today I want to talk about the demographic characteristics of this population. We also collected secondary data. We scoured the available literature for information to compare to the transgender population. We looked from US Census data to really small-scale studies of transgender needs in places like San Francisco and Washington, DC. And what we found that the transgender community outside of prison has also not been systematically or representatively sampled. So I do want to give a few warnings about the data that I'm going to be presenting today. Because we used 27 different sources of secondary data, in addition to the interviews that we conducted, the exact definitions of certain variables may vary, the time frames may vary, and more importantly, we have multiple estimates for certain dimensions that I'm going to be discussing because we tried to get as much convergent validity as possible across our different sources, but it wasn't always available. So when we couldn't find any convergence, we tried to display a range. This will all make a little bit more sense when I start showing some graphs. Now, for the next couple of slides, I'm going to show a lot of different graphs, and basically the colors stay the same. On the far right, you're going to have transgender inmates in the bluish purple. And I'm not going to take a lot of time going over these graphs in terms of numbers. Really, I just wanted to present a series of visuals so you can see the stark discrepancies between transgender inmates and these other populations on different measures of health and social location. Or, I'm sorry, health, welfare, and social location. So I'm going to start with education and employment, which actually were the only two dimensions that transgender inmates fared relatively well on. Now, when I say relatively well, clearly they're not doing as well as the non-incarcerated US and California populations, but they're doing a little bit better than other incarcerated populations or even the non-incarcerated transgender population. Employment is similar. Transgender inmates actually did a little worse in terms of employment than the non-incarcerated transgender population, but they actually did a little bit better than the other populations. This was surprising. Now when the kind of disheartening things come to mind. When we interviewed these women, we talked about employment not just in terms of whether they were employed or unemployed prior to incarceration. We wanted to know how they were employed, what they felt about their employment. And we found that securing employment was as much about self-respect as it was about financial stability. One woman told us, you have to show you can be productive. You'll get a lot of respect if you can get a real job. And this concept of a real job came up a lot because sex work also came up as employment and occupation, but obviously not legal employment. And a lot of the women that we spoke to reported feeling marginalized, saying that sex work was the only option left for them. One woman said, look at me, sex work is the only line of business some of us can get. They're not going to hire us at Target. And then she went on very upsettingly to say, only real girls get hired at Target. So sex work became a really viable source of employment for these women. As I mentioned, there are many different reasons for this. Financial gain. Some women said, I wanted to do it just to see how much I was worth or just to fit in because it's so prevalent. And in fact, 40% of our respondents reported engaging in sex work at some point in their life. I don't have a graph to show about this because I couldn't find comparable data on any of these other populations, but I can't imagine that other estimates would be higher than 40%. And even more poignantly, one woman said, sex work is something I have to do to survive. Of course I'd prefer not to do it. I'd prefer not to be in here, but I am. You just make the best of it. That's all you can do, really. Now, moving on to a couple of different dimensions away from employment, education, and sex work, health really loomed large. Health issues for transgender inmates were kind of primary concern for a lot of reasons, HIV, hormone maintenance while in prison, things like that. But we asked some pretty standard questions about mental health, and as you can see, the transgender inmate population fares far worse on mental health lines, and also in terms of alcohol abuse and a history of drug abuse. Now, HIV, I want to take a little bit more time and look at this graph. In order to even get the estimates for the US and California populations to register, I had to skew the graph so much because that's how high the prevalence rate of HIV is for transgender inmates. There are two different estimates here. We couldn't ask about HIV for various reasons related to confidential data and HIPAA. But we have pretty good estimates from a healthcare worker within the California prison system who puts transgender HIV prevalence for transgender inmates between 60 and 80%. That is phenomenal. For the larger population of the US, it's 0.5%. I mean, the difference there is just unbelievable. Another way that transgender inmates were frequently at higher risk when they were outside in the community was in terms of homelessness. And homelessness kind of emerged as a nexus where all of these different lines of marginality converged. Because they were homeless, they had a harder time securing employment. They had lower educational levels than those who were not homeless, that type of thing. It put their health at greater risk. And most importantly, it put them at greater risk for victimization. Now, the estimate for transgender inmates who had been victimized outside of prison, which is what this is showing, was almost 90%. This is not even including victimization in prison, which was also staggeringly high. It was 70% had been sexually assaulted while they were in prison. And sexual assault outside of the community was even higher. It was 75%. So they were more likely to be sexually victimized outside in the community even than they were while they were locked inside these men's prisons. And I want to make sure before I finish up that I'm not just talking about transgender inmates and their marginality in terms of different sized and colored bars on a chart. It's really important to me that I convey the lived experience that these women tried to convey to me and my co-researchers during our study. And I think this one quote sums it up really nicely. This was a study of violence, first and foremost. This one woman, she was about 40 years old, black. She was in a minimum security facility for a property crime she had been in for about 5 years. She said, "We're surrounded by men, real men with short fuses. It's not easy. It's worse than on the street. Here they are, and they don't have women, even women they can buy. We're the best they got, and they hate that." Now, on to the conclusions. As you can see from all of the different dimensions of social status and location that I've discussed, there are multiple intersecting dimensions of marginality that transgender inmates experience on a daily basis and experienced prior to their incarceration. These are along social, economic, and experiential lines. And marginalization of this magnitude and along this many different dimensions has great consequences for their life chances. Even if these women get out of prison, which it's not certain that many of them are going to, they're going to face a life that is incredibly difficult, probably even more difficult than it was before they were incarcerated. And because of that, I thought it was important to try to tell their story today. And this quote by de Tocqueville I thought was very true. I'm in a criminology department, we really like this quote. But I thought that nowhere was it more true than with regard to transgender inmates. It is well known that most individuals on whom the criminal law inflicts punishment have been unfortunate before they become guilty. And that is absolutely true for transgender